crickets sang their songs in the early German evening, but Laurie barely noticed them in her excitement as she led Naseer out to her car. She couldn't wait to show him her artwork. A United States native, Laurie had moved to Germany in 2003 with her husband, who was a German native. At that time, she never had been able to believe all that the intervening 13+ years had brought. Refugees, both legal and otherwise, from Syria, Nigeria, other countries, had started coming to the Musingen army camp just outside of town, fleeing from the wars in their respective countries. She had volunteered to help with that. With her slowly improving German and her native English, she was a highly desired translator for the refugees, many of whom did speak English. The camp held approximately 200 people, mostly of whom were young men. One day, while sitting in a service at her church, she'd really noticed how much extra time the translation of the German service into English was taking, and she decided, along with a few other people, to start a small English language service for the refugees at a separate time in the church's building. She led worship as best as she could, which was difficult with all of the differing cultures and ethnicities. But soon attendance began getting larger, with refugees from other faiths, primarily Muslim, and other languages, necessitating more translation. So the service organizers group grew to also include several refugees. Among them was Naseer, the Iraqi keyboard player who had given his testimony tonight and who was now eagerly trailing her to her car. Naseer was a young man from a long line of Christian believers. Because of the strong faith of his forefathers, he was very brave, and he was unafraid to share his faith. So, when the request had gone up at the planning meeting a few weeks ago for someone to share a time when they knew that God was real, he'd been happy to share it. It's important to note for the story that Laurie and Naseer had not talked to each other about what that story would be before tonight. The story that Naseer had shared had been this. He and a few other men had fled Iraq to Germany as the war heated up. They had had the help of several guides. For a time, they were forced to hide in a house for 3 days and nights without food or water, as provisions cost money that they didn't have, as they'd spent everything on their guides, giving everything that they had on the wish to simply stay alive. When their smuggler guide came to lead them to the next safe house, they'd walk by the light of the mid-June moon and stars, struggling through the surrounding forest, weak and hungry. When they came to the edge of a roadway, they jumped back when the bright lights of a car suddenly shone out on the road, and Naseer fell on the ground under the dense trees, struggling to remain as still as possible to avoid being seen. As he lay there, he felt something like a hard ball under one of his hands. He picked it up and examined it. It was a very large, apple-like fruit. But apples weren't currently in season. He had no idea what it was. But even so, he was literally starving, so he took a bite. It was delicious. As he looked around on the ground, he found many more, and he offered them to his fellow travelers, and they all ate for the first time in 3 days. He knew at that moment that God was there for him, that God would provide for their needs to get safely to their destination. He knew that he was seen, and he mattered, and he really wasn't the hunted mouse that he felt like he was. As he finally got to Laurie's car, the moonlight shone through the glass of her car's trunk, and he gasped at the artwork he saw inside. You see, a few nights before Naseer was scheduled to give his testimony, Laurie had sat down at her table and drew some pictures in oil pastels. Then, for some previously unknown reason, she placed them in her car's trunk and took them to the church service with her, which was something she'd never before done. But now she knew that the picture that lay on top was the reason why she'd brought them with her tonight. It was an illustration of a large tree with one lower hanging branch, and from that branch hung an enormous apple-like fruit. The fruit was so large that it contained a window and a door, and behind the window and the apple was a woman working inside. Laurie knew that the artwork was meant for Naseer, and as he saw the artwork, he immediately wanted to share it with the church group inside. He wanted them to know that it really was a story of God, and not something that they had talked about beforehand. Some believed that they hadn't talked to each other, but some didn't. Regardless, Naseer was reminded of a night when God had provided, and he knew that he still would. Laurie, for her part, was encouraged in her ever-growing faith that God used her in many ways, and she hopes to have many more opportunities to use her art to do so. As to what the ultimate meaning of the painting was, we don't know, but God knows, and that's all that really matters. At that moment, it was encouragement for both of them. May you hear God's voice and dream His dreams for your life. May you have the courage to listen and to follow those things that He shows you. May you have the humility to rely on His strength, the wisdom to know His will from your own, and the peace that only He can give. Thank you for listening.